Jenny, thank you so much for joining us on the Entrepreneurial Success Podcast. I'm really, really thrilled to have you here, in particular because today we're going to talk all about podcasting. But before we get started, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you've got going on?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name's Jenny. I am the owner of Savvy Podcast Agency, which is a podcast management and marketing agency. So basically, we handle not only like the behind the scenes things like editing and writing show notes and all that stuff, but we also handle actually getting your podcast out into the world, which I think is something a lot of people struggle with. It's not necessarily like the behind the scenes stuff. It's just like getting seen and getting more listeners. And I think that's the biggest part of having a podcast. Like, obviously you don't want to put all this effort into it and not have anyone, see you or find you. So that's like our big focus. And that's something I noticed was a gap in the podcasting space, because a lot of people do the tasks, but they don't do like the actual marketing strategy and things like that. So yeah, that's pretty much my business in a nutshell.
And then who in particular do you work with then? What is your particular market?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of females. My branding is kind of girly, so that's who I tend to attract. I do have some males in my audience, and that's great. I appreciate that. But yeah, mostly females who are really looking to use their podcast strategically, and they're not hobbyists. There are business owners that are like, I want to use my podcast to get clients or customers if they're like a digital product-based business, and not just like use it just to put content out to the world. Because I think it's like one of those things like, yeah, it's a great content medium, but like if you're not using it strategically, it's just adding more work to your plate instead of actually benefiting what you're doing in the world.
Yeah, and I'm really excited because we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But tell us first about how you got started. How did you get started with doing podcasting, and what was the motivation behind it?
So it's really funny. I actually didn't start doing podcasting like in the beginning. I've been in business for about 3.5 years now, and my background was in social media. So that's where the whole marketing thing comes in. And I did social media for a really long time, up until probably June is when I made the official switch to podcast focus. And I had started my podcast about January of 2018. So almost 2 full years ago. And I just fell in love with it. And I was like, what can I do that kind of integrates social media and this? And I kind of figured, all right, let's do podcast strategy and marketing, and like not only the behind the scenes stuff, but really helping people grow their podcast. Cause I know that's what people want. They just want to put a podcast out in the world and then have like 10 listens every week. That's not really beneficial to anyone. So that's kind of how that started. And it was so nice to be able to have that marketing background already, because I had done social media for so long. And it's something that is, I still love, but I was just so tired of all the algorithms and stuff. And now with this, I get to kind of intertwine my love for podcasting and helping people get their podcasts out into the world, versus just feeling like I'm working with a bunch of different people to grow their Instagram or whatever. It actually has like a specific purpose with the social media and stuff. So.
And how do you find it? Because I think looking at my experience when I started my podcasting, I think and we'll talk about this a lot more later on, but there's that overwhelm. So when you talk to your clients about them starting their podcasting, what is that biggest thing that you find that they always have when they have to, or when they want to start a podcast?
So I think a lot of the time they don't realize how much work it actually is, because then I present them like, okay, here's the pre-launch stuff, but then you also have to do like this every single week to, get your episodes out there. And they're like, what? Like they just are so shocked by it, because, they kind of expect like the editing and the show notes every week, but they don't think about like all the pre-launch tasks that they need to do. So like, creating the show cover art and, coming up with a logo and like getting their website ready if they're like making a brand new website for their podcast and all those different tasks. They don't think about that. And then we like have that conversation. We're like, ooh, wow, we have so much going on. I don't even know what to do. Like there's just so much going on. So that's kind of where we come in. And, I have both podcast management and then like a podcast launch strategy. So we help them either if they already are established and have their show, or, if they're starting from the beginning and want to just launch without having to worry about all the moving parts. So I think that's kind of the thing that people struggle with the most, just not knowing how much time it's going to take, and then getting in like 3 to 5 months and like not having time, and then they fall off the wagon because they don't have an editor, they don't have someone to do their show notes, and they just want to create the content and they don't have like the resources to just do that and not have to handle all the other back end stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense then. So talk to us a little bit then about how to use podcasting, not just in order to get content out into the world, but obviously how to use that in relation to a marketing strategy. I'm really excited to hear about what you've got to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things like, yeah, you can put all this content out into the world, but if it's not strategic, then it's not doing you any good. It's not doing your audience any good. So I really think it's important to like, whenever you're crafting your episodes, to really have the end game goal in mind. What do you want to do? Do you want to get more customers as a service-based business owner? Do you want to get more customers as a product-based business owner? Like, what is your end game goal? Do you want to grow your email list? Like, what you have to think about that from the get-go. And a lot of people don't. They're just like, I really want to start a podcast. And then they get into it and they're just like, all their episodes are great and they're really great at positioning them as an expert, but there's no like strict call to action or anything that entices the person to take an extra step. Mm-hmm. Because with podcasting, it's such like a one-way medium. With the actual like platform, you need to have a way for your audience to come and connect with you. And that's something people don't do. So something like a Facebook group, or telling them to join your email list, or, engage with you on Instagram, get in your DMs on Instagram, email you, whatever that action is. I think a lot of people just forget to specify that. And it's not doing them any good, because the only thing you can really do on podcast apps is listen and leave a review. And with the reviews, we can't even interact with those people because there's no way to comment back or anything. Yeah. So once they leave the review, that's pretty much your last bit of communication, unless you are directing them to a place where they can actually chat with you.
Absolutely. So is there a specific marketing strategy that you're quite fond of, that you use yourself, that you can maybe tell us a little bit about what you do in particular for your podcast?
Yeah, so I think for me, the main thing is really directing them elsewhere. So like once they get all this content, like I either will say like, there are some things that I'll add, like, okay, well, in episode 84, we chatted about this, so go listen to that, to kind of continue the listening thing. That's one thing. Or I also have like in my outro, it basically says like, go, if you want to learn more, if you want to like engage with people who are podcasters, because that's what my podcast is about, I tell them to go to my Facebook group. Or, sometimes I'll say like, DM me on Instagram your favorite strategy from this episode or something. And I just try to get them off the platform. Like I still want them listening, of course, but I want to make connections deeper, because people aren't just going to work with you based off of hearing a 5-second ad about your services or your product or whatever. So that's my main tip, is just getting them off the platform and chatting with you in another area, because podcasting doesn't really have any way for you to do that within the platform itself right now.
And talk to us a little bit about the pre-launch strategy, because you mentioned that a few times earlier on. What does your pre-launch strategy look like? What are a couple of tips basically that you can give us there?
Yeah, so other than like the basic, like get your cover art and get all that stuff together, I really sit down with the client when we work together for the launch strategy, and we map out like a marketing plan. Like, okay, this is what we're going to post on social media. Like, here's some ideas on what to do with your Instagram stories. Here, like, you should do a countdown and giveaways and stuff like that. One second, my dog is
That's like, okay. I heard your puppy is squeaking there with the toy.
I know. I'm like, okay, we can't be doing that right now. Yeah, so for the pre-launch, like we sit down, we make an entire marketing strategy, kind of telling them what they need to be doing on social media and their email list, and like kind of mapping that out, because a lot of people launch their podcast and then they're launching to crickets. They might have like an audience already, but they don't hype it up. So their audience doesn't know that they should care. They're just kind of like, oh, great, maybe I'll go listen, but they don't actually take action. So I think that's the really important thing, is like making sure that you're like dropping little hints and like using countdowns. And I know not everyone uses Instagram, but Instagram has so many cool features, like countdowns and like all these different things you do with your Instagram stories and like giveaways and things like that, and just really getting people excited. And I think that's like a big part of it, because if you're not doing these types of things before you launch, you're gonna be really disappointed come launch day, when you only have like a handful of listeners. And it's not to say that when you launch, you're going to have thousands of listeners just because you used a pre-launch strategy, but it still gives you kind of a leg up over the people who don't.
Yes. And now the other thing you want to talk about as well is what I think most listeners would really want to know, for those in particular who want to start a podcast, who's been thinking about it, but they don't know all the ins and outs of how to start a podcast. So walk us a little bit through about your take on how to start a podcast and what you maybe have done, if you've got some examples of those of your own or of those of some of your customers that you've been recently working with. It'd be really great to share those.
Yeah. And I love sharing this because I think it's like something that holds people back because they just don't even know where to begin. So a lot of people freak out about like the tools and the technology and stuff, but it honestly doesn't have to be perfect. That is my biggest thing that I tell my clients. Like, you can launch and it doesn't have to be perfect. Like, that's okay. And I am such a perfectionist. So if I can do it, you can do it. I mean, you don't need the most high-tech equipment ever. You can have like a mic from Amazon that's like between $60 and $100. It doesn't need to be anything super fancy. You can use a Zoom to record, which is free. You can use there's free editing softwares out there. If you have a Mac, you can use GarageBand. If you can also use something called Audacity, which is free. If you want to use something paid, that's perfectly fine too, but you don't have to spend a fortune to start your podcast. I think really at the beginning, it's all about your content and your strategy versus the sound quality. Of course, you want to improve over time. You don't want to be like 3 years into podcasting and, still using, a super cheap mic. You might want to upgrade at that point. But I think that's really important, just to know that you don't need all this fancy technology to get started. And I think that's something where people get hung up. And they think like, oh, I can't edit my podcast. And honestly, it's not hard to edit your podcast. I mean, it does take a while at first once you're first starting to get used to it. But a lot of people think they need to edit out every single and every single like, and then it just sounds super inauthentic. Like, yeah, that would be hard to edit out every single and every single like. So I think that's another thing. Like, just don't try to make it perfect with your editing either, because then it also sounds so unnatural.
Yes.
Like, have you ever heard a show where people try to edit out so many things and it just ends up like not sounding great?
No, it sounds like a robot talking almost in the background.
Exactly. So yeah, that's like another thing. Like, don't let technology hang you up. And then, like I said, you don't really need that many tools. But another thing that I recommend if you're thinking about starting a podcast is really that you just have a plan in place and map out your episodes and batch record. Like, that is my biggest thing. Like, unless you have a show that is like pop culture or news that you can't batch record because it's going to be like irrelevant when you actually post it, you need a batch record. So something like a business podcast, like, things aren't going to change that much between now and like a month or two from now. It's so helpful to batch record, because I'll tell you, when I first started, I batch record probably about a month in advance, and I've always done this, but I just started implementing batch weeks. So literally I'll just record straight for a week with guests, and I think I do about 3 to 4 a day, which gives me like quite a bit, 12 weeks of content, and that's more than a quarter. So I only record once a quarter. And it's just so helpful. Yeah, it's so helpful. Yeah. It doesn't have to be overwhelming, because I know if people like try to record every single week, that's something they run into and they get behind and they're like, oops, I haven't put out episodes in 4 weeks because I got really busy. So batch recording is really important. And then a launch tip that I have is, since you're already batch recording, you need to put out like 3 to 4 episodes plus your welcome episode when you launch, because you want people to be able to go to your podcast and have more than just one episode to listen to, because that makes them become like loyal fans. They're like excited and they're like, ooh, I want to hear what's next. So then they have like a couple episodes to kind of listen to, and it just makes it so much better for them, because they're not just like, ooh, one regular episode and a welcome episode, and then they're not as excited. They don't get to like binge. And people are all about the binge these days. So.
And one of the things that I've found very interesting, and this is only from my kind of experience, so to speak. When I started my podcast, I had the tiniest little microphone. Oh my gosh, the sound quality was so bad. But then I thought, instead of investing in a better microphone, I got a platform which was absolutely for free, and I just went and I edited the hell out of it to make it sound as best as I can. And my first couple of episodes went out like that. And they were okay, but at the end of the day, the content that I gave was so much more valuable than actually the perfectionism of having that podcast episode.
Yep.
Talk to us a little bit as well about show notes, because I think that's another thing as well that people sometimes get confused about, and what the importance really are of show notes when it comes to a podcast. So what is your experience with that?
So I think show notes are really important. I am a huge advocate for them because think about it, like, that not everyone can actually listen to your podcast. There are some people who don't like podcasts, but they still want the content, or they might have a disability where they can't listen, they're deaf or something like that. So I think show notes really help with that. And I used to just do bullet points, and I've started actually writing like at least 1 or 2 paragraphs and then some bullet points. And now I've been linking transcripts to the episodes as well. So for people that can't listen, I think it's really important. And it is a little bit of an extra step on my part, because I don't use a paid translator. I use one that's free. So I have to go in and like make any edits, because it doesn't always say the right things. Like, I know it sounds funny sometimes, so I make those edits, but it's so worth it to me to know that if someone that has a disability wants to listen but can't, they're able to look at the show notes or the transcript or whatever, and I'm making sure that it's as accessible as possible for people. And another thing I kind of want to start doing is including video, like not like on YouTube or anything, but in the show notes if people want to watch, because I just think because then you can put subtitles on the video and things like that with YouTube and stuff. So, things like that. I think it's just really important, and it's also good for SEO. So if you have show notes, you're able to kind of play to Google. And if you don't, then you're kind of like missing out on that Google juice, and you're not able to, people won't find you in the search engine as often. So I think that's really important. And then your audience isn't like constantly trying to write down links. If they really want a link, they can just go click it in the show notes versus like having to figure out how to spell your guest name that has a really complicated last name or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things as well, which I have been thinking about a lot, is doing transcripts, but I haven't gotten to that stage yet. Obviously, these show notes is very important because of the SEO in order for Google to find you, and also Pinterest, so to speak. But with regards to the transcripts, do you find that the transcripts are also very helpful for SEO, or is that more to do with your show notes?
I link it as a PDF. So it's just like a PDF of it. I'm not copying and pasting into the show notes, because I feel like that would be a little crazy, because it would look really long. But I try to keep my show notes at least 300 words or more, so that it's good for Google. And then I link to the transcript, like, you want to read the full transcript, click here. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I might play with it and do like timestamps for important things as well. And then still include like the PDF. So I'm not just including the entire PDF, like, formatted into the post, because that just sounds like it would be a little messy. But yeah, I think it's just important to have. And it is, like I said, a little bit extra time on your part, unless you use like Timmy, which is a paid one. It's TEMI. I think it's like 10 cents a minute or something. It's not that expensive, but that one's a lot better. You only have to make very minor edits. I use Otter, so OTTER, like little animal, .ai, and that one's free to a certain amount of minutes per month. But you have to make more edits because, it's free. But I just use that one because it's just, why pay if you can spend a little, like 15, 20 minutes just cleaning it up a little bit. That's not that much time on my part. So
now, from your point of view, I think the other thing I wanted to ask is, when you started out, obviously for anybody who's starting out, whether you're already in a business or not, you don't want to go and spend a lot of money just on tools. There's some really fancy microphones out there, editing software, and people start downloading music to have an intro, and and they just try and make things so overcomplicated. What would be your best step for anybody who wants to start a podcast now, in order to simplify it as much as possible, not get overwhelmed, but at least to get the first 3 or 4 episodes out there so you can start the ball rolling?
Yeah, so I think just like obviously you need a microphone. You can't just use the one on your iPhone. I mean, it's okay, but I would prefer someone getting a microphone. There's some that I think the Snowball or Yeti Snowball or whatever is probably like I think
Yes.
it's like $60. So that one's pretty decent for your first few episodes. I have the Blue Yeti, like the bigger microphone, and that one was probably I think 110 or something. So it still wasn't that expensive, but if you think about it, if you're going to be podcasting for a long time, that pays off super quickly. But I don't use paid equipment. My husband actually edits my show for me. We use Audacity and it's free. But GarageBand on your Mac is free. There's tons of tools that are free. I know that I have a second podcast with my friend and she is the editor for that one. I just don't like editing. I mean, I can, but I just don't like it. She uses Camtasia, which is a paid tool. So,
Yes.
there's plenty of tools out there to use. You don't have to pay for it if you don't want to. It's just up to your personal preference. And like I said earlier, Zoom is free. You don't have to pay for Zoom. You can literally just use it as long as you have like just 2 people in the room. It doesn't have a time limit. So I have a paid account because of my joint podcast. We have guests, so it's 3 of us. So I pay for it just so we're not like, oh my gosh, it's 45 minutes and it's about to expire. I have to upgrade or something. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the 3 tools you need. So an editor or an editing tool, a microphone, and like something like Zoom or whatever you want to use for recording the episodes. So it's
Yes.
not super expensive. And like, if that's what's holding you back, don't let it hold you back. Because to me, that's the least scary thing about podcasting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from a motivational point of view, because I think the other thing is as well is people feel a little bit on the edge about putting themselves out there, especially if they're doing it for the first time.
Right.
I mean, it's quite scary knowing, you're hearing your voice for the first time being recorded. And the number one thing is people always say that I don't like the sound of my voice.
Right.
But for me personally, I started getting used to it, so I don't mind it at all.
Right.
But what would you like to say to anybody who's, scared of or have this fear of putting themselves out there and just getting those episodes recorded and putting themselves, on the market, basically saying, here, this is what I've created, listen to me?
Right. I would say just don't let the fear hold you back from taking the action. If you really want to do it, just do it. Like, don't be scared. I will say I am such an introvert, and podcasting was a super huge leap for me, like, especially because I knew I was going to have guests and not just do it solo. Like, so that was even scarier to me because I'm like, oh my God, I have to interview people. And it's funny, I actually had my first interview where I interviewed someone and my first interview where I was interviewed on the exact same day, and it was like a bigger entrepreneur, and I was so nervous, and it ended up being really great, and it was amazing. And and she was like, you're a really good interviewer, and I was like, oh man, that means so much, because it was my first time. I was so nervous, and it's just like one of those things, if you're like introverted, don't let it hold you back. It'll honestly help me come out of my shell even more, because now I just feel so comfortable with being interviewed and so comfortable interviewing people. It's just like night and day. If you've seen, like, if you go back and listen to my first episode, you can definitely tell the difference in my confidence levels, like with talking. And I think that's the same for anyone, whether you're an introvert or extrovert. You can tell the first episode from the most recent one, because people improve so much in such a little amount of time, because they get so used to recording and feeling comfortable behind the mic, and even interviewing people, because that can be tough too, especially if you're asking different questions and you don't always know a lot about the subject that you're interviewing people on. So
yeah, and I think that's part of the reason as well why I love interviews so much. My podcast, I started as solo. I did all of the episodes in the beginning, and then I just got this fascination with interviewing other people, and that's kind of expanded now, and that's what I enjoy so much.
Right.
But I think the one thing which you really pointed out there is just the confidence, how your confidence grows over time. So yes, the first couple of episodes won't be perfect. And let's face it, we're not going for perfection at the end of the day.
Right.
But then the more of these episodes you put out there, the more your confidence builds, the more ideas you start getting. And you start thinking more about those marketing strategies you spoke about earlier as well. And it's just something that starts evolving with time and starts getting better and better and better. And yes, it will never be perfect, but it will always evolve. And I think that's what you've got to look forward to. But you've got to make a start. Nothing will evolve unless you make a start. So for any of you who is ready to start your own podcast, I highly suggest that you just get the couple of tools together. It doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to pay a lot of money for it, but just listen to what Jenny is saying and just go for it. Get the first couple of podcast episodes out there and just see how it goes. Make sure you've got a pre-launch strategy as well so people can know about what you're launching and when you're launching. And just share your knowledge and your experience with the world.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think the great thing about having both solo and guest episodes is that you're not only able to share your expertise with your solo interviews, but you're also able to interject some of your knowledge within the guest interviews as well. Like it gives you more content, but you're also able to show up as an expert with the guest interviews too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm so excited about this. And I think this is something you and I can talk on for quite some time because we're both podcasters. We love it so much. Is there anything else that you want to share with the audience, in particular with regards to what they can do if they want to start a podcast or what they can do in order to expand their podcast marketing? Any other tips that you wanted to share?
Yeah, so just one final thing I think that people really struggle with is that they get into it and then they realize like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. This is so much work. And I think that's one of the big things that people just, that's their biggest struggle. So I want to just encourage you, like if you feel like stressed out and overwhelmed and stuff, don't quit your podcast, especially if you really love it. Like just find someone to help you. It doesn't have to be for everything. It can be for just editing or just show notes, whatever your biggest struggle and whatever the bottleneck of you getting those episodes out there is, other than recording, because obviously only you can do that. Just have someone help you. It doesn't have to be super expensive. It doesn't have to be tons of hours a month or a week. Just find that one thing you can outsource and then, continue on. Don't let that be the bottleneck for you with getting episodes out into the world.
Now, the thing is if you want to start a podcast episode and you're not quite sure where to start, I highly suggest that you reach out to Jenny. Jenny's website will be at the bottom of my show notes, so you can obviously go and have a look there. And then Jenny's also got a great freebie that she's giving away today. So Jenny, why don't you tell us a little bit about the freebie? That's really great.
Yeah, so I have the podcast launch blueprint. It is basically 5 steps that you need to launch your podcast with a bang. And you can go and grab that at savvypodcastagency.com/podcast-launch-blueprint. And I'm sure you will link that in the show notes. But absolutely. It's really helpful and kind of it's not like, it's definitely not everything you need to do because that would take a long time to outline, but it's just the 5 steps like, okay, this is what you need to do, get your tools ready, XYZ tips you need to get started. And I just think that's really important. And that's where a lot of people get hung up with the launch. Once they're launched, they can pretty much do it as long as they actually like it. Some people find they hate podcasting and then they quit. But if you're actually enjoying it, like don't quit. That is my main advice because, I've been doing this for over almost 2 years now. And it's just like one of the most amazing things that I ever could have done for my business. And I know so many podcasters that feel the same way. They're like, wow, why didn't I start this sooner? So I think if it's something you've been on the fence about, definitely dip your toes in soon and see if that's something that you really like and that's a medium you really enjoy. Because I think podcasting is so magical, and I know it sounds silly, but it really is. It's just such an amazing medium and the one that feels most aligned with me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, I agree with you in that terms because when I started podcasting as well, I wasn't quite sure if it is something that I would enjoy doing. And the first couple of episodes went out. I was freaking out about them and I was so nervous. But then after that, the more I started doing it, the more I started enjoying it. So much so that even though I run a blog at the same time, but my podcasts are so much more popular than my blogs, really. And I think partially also because I enjoy it so much more. I mean, I enjoy blogging, but podcasting, that takes the cake.
Right.
So for me, that is definitely something where my energy comes alive. And I think people can hear that as well when they listen to you and they're taking notes, and they can feel your energy through your voice and how you're talking. It is so much more powerful as well to do it that way.
Right.
Which is also why I enjoy doing these recordings, because we're doing, apart from just audio, it's a video as well. So people can see Jenny's face, they can see my face, they can see the energy between us while we're having this conversation. So both mediums are very, very powerful. So if you definitely want to do something like this, then by all means, reach out to Jenny, and I'm sure she'd be more than happy to help you and see how to get your podcast up and running and make sure that it ties in with a good marketing strategy so you can get heard. Jenny, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate your time for being here. I'm so excited, just to share all of this with everyone. And I hope every one of you enjoyed this. And let us know. Please leave us any comments you have below this podcast episode. If you want to know more, reach out to Jenny or myself, and then we would be more than happy to get back to you. Jenny, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I think you and I need to stay in touch. We've got a lot more in common.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you. This is obviously one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I'm honored to have been here.
Oh, bless you. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy your day, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you. Will do.
Take care.
You too. Bye.